Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to show you different calculator functions that might be useful for mathematics competitions. So these functions, you don't need a graphing calculator to graph these functions and look at the values. Instead, you're going to need at least a calculator that can use tables. So you type in a function into that calculator and it produces a table with x values and then the f of x values corresponding with the x values. So we're going to start with some basic functions that I discovered, and I probably didn't really technically invent them because other people have probably found this before me. So the first function that I discovered is a function that checks for numbers greater than or equal to some real number y. So, this function is f of x equals the square root of x minus y to the 0th power. So, say you want to check x is greater than or equal to some numbers, let's say 5, then your function would be the square root of x minus 5 to the 0th power. And what this function will give you in the table, if you're using a table, if it's greater than equal to y, you'll get 1. And if x is less than y, you'll get an error, because you can't square root negative numbers without getting imaginary numbers. So after finding a function that could check for greater than or equal to some number y, I decided to find a function that could check for strictly greater than y. So this function is a lot more complicated than the function we saw before. Let me just call this function f of 2 of x so we don't confuse it with the one before. And f of 2 of x was x minus y divided by the absolute value of x minus y plus 1, and everything is all divided by 2. And this function, it seems really complicated, but it's not that complicated once you get how it works. And you can pause the video and look at this function and get why this works. And if this number is greater than y, then you'll get 1. If it's equal to y, you will get an error, and if it's less than y, then you'll get a 0. So this function really gives you 3 values, but we're really looking for the 1s here, and when you see a 1, then you know that x is greater than y in that case, strictly greater than y. So these functions are pretty boring, and we want to find some more interesting functions. And of course, some of you may be asking about, what about the less than checker functions? Well, I'll leave that to you to find those functions, because they're actually not that hard to find once you see these functions. So let's go on to some more complex functions that require a little bit more thinking to discover. So first, there's a function that can check divisibility by y. And this function is actually really simple if you take a look at it. So I'm going to find some place to write. So this is going to be called f of 3 of x. And f of 3 of x is equal to the absolute value of x divided by y factorial and to the 0 power. And you can see why this works. So we're just checking for divisibility by y, and let's suppose that x is a multiple of y. Then the number in here is going to be a whole number, and since it's a whole number, then we can factorial it. Now say x is negative and y is positive, but x is still a multiple of y. Then we still have this still as an integer, and although it's negative and we can't factorial negative numbers, there's an absolute value on the outside that goes first. So it turns that number positive and we factorial it. And then it becomes 1. Now, in the case that x is not a multiple of y, then we have that x divided by, let's say, a number, it gives us 0.2. X divided by y is 0.2. Then we'll have the factorial of 0.2. However, we can't factorial a decimal number, so it'll just give us an error. So this function, whenever the number is a multiple of y, then we'll get a 1. But if the number is not a multiple of y, x is not a multiple of y, then we'll get an error. So this function might actually be useful. And you can reverse this function, so switch the y's and x's, and you'll get a function that looks somewhat like this, and it checks if x is a factor of y. And this one's really interesting. So I don't have much space. Let's call this f of 4 of x. And this is going to be equal to the square root of x minus 1 times 0. And you'll see why I did this later. Plus the absolute value of y divided by x. And again, we have that factorial to the 0 power. And this function simply checks if x is a positive factor of y, because x can't be negative, then it would not technically qualify as a factor of y. So this is where this thing comes in here. This part simply checks if x is a factor, if x is positive. So if x is negative, then this square root right here will become an imaginary number, and that obviously gives us an error. So the multiplying by 0 is if x is actually positive. So let's say x is 2, then we'll get 1 from the square root. And multiplying it by 0, then we'll just get 0, and nothing. It adds nothing to this value right here. So it really just checks if that number is a positive, if x is positive, before going on to the other function right here. So in this function we have y divided by x factorial, and you can basically get why this works from the before function that I explained to you earlier. So if it is a factor of y, then we get a 1, and if it's not a factor, we'll get an error. And this is actually one of the more useful functions that I will talk to you about in this video, because you can see you can technically check if a number is prime by using this function, because if you have a table and you look at each of the numbers and look if there's a 1, if there is a 1, then x is a factor of y, then obviously y is not a prime number. So that one is probably the most useful out of the functions that I've discovered so far. But that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed looking at these 4 functions and might apply them later in life maybe, or a math competition. I'll probably find more functions, and this is only part 1 of the series of calculator functions that are really interesting to me. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to watch out for more cool functions that might be helpful in math competitions.